Good morning, everyone. It's a blessing to bring you this podcast, Insightful Foundations, sponsored by the University Memorial Chapel at Morgan State University, along with the Office of Residence Life. Last week, we were blessed to have, I think, truly an insightful discussion about the nature of discovery, those who have a vision and who can take the work and the effort and the legacy to build upon that vision. And we're talking about the founding of the Centenary Biblical Institute as the forerunner for Morgan State College, Morgan State University, and also discovering that in the 80th year of the celebration of the chapel being constructed in 1941, one of our very own who has an intimate connection with this history is Professor Dale Glenwood Green. Dale is probably one of the most preeminent scholars when it comes to being able to yoke together one's professional acumen in terms of restorative architecture with the significance of real history, a history that came alive just 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, beginning with the discussion in 1864 at the then Sharp Street Methodist Episcopal Church, and one that closely parallels the evolution of historically Black colleges and universities, but more importantly, the evolution of people of color being able to take seriously their own progress as it relates to education, as it relates to advocacy and justice issues. We were all just so lifted last week to discover this wonderful reservoir of talent. And I don't think it is coincidental at all that God has planted Professor Green at Morgan State University. I think it was meant to be from a providential perspective, even before you were made in the secret of your mother's womb. And parenthetical to that discussion last week was another insightful observation that I had about someone who I've grown to really appreciate his ministry and his personhood. And mostly, I appreciated the fact that he's so non-assuming. That is Clarence Wayman. Clarence and I have been yoking together in ministry. He really is in the position of assistant to the dean of the Memorial Chapel, but more interestingly, Clarence goes back to the preaching Waymans. That's what I'm going to call it, like, the Fighting Sullivans. We'll call you all the preaching Waymans. His great-great-great-great-grandfather was part of that legacy of the visionary founders of the Centenary Biblical Institute. And it is amazing that from that generation to this generation, you are what we always call in Hebrew scriptures, the living remnant of what was planted in your great-great-great-grandfather's spirit. And I, for one, am very grateful that you're part of this ministry. Without any further ado, I want to introduce our presenter for the morning and ask you to, if you haven't already, contact your friends and tell them if you want to be able to connect the reality of the HBCU with more than just a theoretical analysis, but in fact, understanding why we are and whose we are and how we got there. We aptly call this session today, looking back at our past in order to understand where we're going. We will never have a sense of where we're going. Let's understand the true significance of our history. With that, I will turn it over to my friend, my colleague, a member of the Friends of the Chapel, and a person that is, I think, singularly responsible for the University Chapel being the first and only building on campus with the National Historic Registry, Professor Dale Green.
Thank you, Dean Keels, for that great introduction on this morning. And again, thank you for the second invitation to be extended to continue on, if you will, with part two of this important presentation on the history and evolution of our beloved chapel as part of the Insightful Foundations discussions. I bring greetings, of course, to you all that have joined with us and to those that we know will be able to also view this and participate in this later. I'm very pleased to see those that are here friends and Morgan alum and Morgan colleagues and others. Certainly welcome you all to this part 2 session. I'm going to move very swiftly through our presentation. We had to sort of move to a part 2 as the sort of history and significance of the chapel is quite extensive. It's very difficult, obviously, to try to compress it all into one session as we learn. But we're going to try to put the final installment, if you will, on today. So I'm very elated to be able to come back in this session and do that. I will do a recap of some of what we discussed to help those that are joining us for the first time, and then delve very quickly into the items of today's discussion. So I lifted the African proverb that I often lift as it's very relevant, of course, to the establishment of Morgan State University in our last session, and re-offer it again as it's very important to understand how those early individuals at the helm of our institution in the chapel were very much guided by their African ancestry and by such African proverbs as this: when you pray, move with your feet. And in a more modern sort of contemporary version of this, we can look at this through the lens of the spirit of Black activism. Dr. Holland opened us up this morning with her sweater, and it certainly reads Black Lives Matter. And certainly in this climate, the Black Lives Matter activism, agenda, and initiative is very important. But certainly as we look at what was going on in the 1800s when Morgan State University was being founded, Black Lives Mattered then, Black Lives Matter now, and Black lives will always matter. And certainly when we look at the history and evolution of our institution and the chapel, all of this can be made very clear through this establishment. The slide to go to the next one here. Hopefully you all are able to see the screen here. And so one of the things that we lifted up in the last session as well, just to recap, is that Morgan has always mattered. It's important to understand that Morgan's raison d'etre and its founding mission was centered around the moral and intellectual elevation. And that still holds true even in today's mission of the university, and certainly our role and our relevancy. Certainly our university is a national treasure, and on many levels, you will be able to identify and connect with the importance and significance of our being a national treasure. Today, you will also equally be able to see additional race men and women. We highlighted many of them in our last session, and it's important to understand that these race men and race women were loyal members of the Black race who dedicated their lives to the contributions of the betterment of Black people. And it's important for us to continue to remember them and highlight their contributions. As it was already mentioned, and as I addressed at length more in our last session, certainly within my own ancestry, which is joined with Reverend Clarence Wayman that's on with us as well, these race men and race women were integral, not only in our own personal families, but they were integral in the establishment of such institutions as our beloved Morgan State University today, and the overall Black society as we would have known it then, and as we even know it now. And so through marriages, as I've mentioned, we're joined with Frederick Douglass on my maternal history side, where Reverend Wayman is, and tying back to Bishop Alexander Wayman, a founding bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And then on my paternal history side, Reverend Samuel Green Sr., one of our visionary African-American founders of the Centenary Biblical Institute, now Morgan State University, and through his first cousin, who was Harriet-Tubman, whose mother was Harriet Rick Green. And so she was a part of the Green family. Her mother and his father were brothers and sisters. And so through that whole lens of our early race men and race women, who, again, as I mentioned, not only are in my own personal family, but in your personal family, certainly you have race men and race women who were advancing the Black society and were working for the betterment of Black people. What we have been attempting to do at Morgan State University, and certainly through the lens of these insightful foundations, and in particular as part of part one and part two here, is really to underscore the spiritual heritage and foundation of Morgan State University, because it is a state university. It is today a public institution, but it was then a private Methodist institution. And for many persons, this history is the lost history. This history is the least understood as far as the role of the Black church in particular, and the role of a spiritual heritage and foundation. And so we initially, as an institution, began to more formally embark upon this during our sesquicentennial, our 150th anniversary, and we held a sesquicentennial worship service. And I spoke more about that in length. But it's important for us to understand that as a public institution, whom was formerly a private Methodist institution, that we were birthed out of a 1787 institution in Baltimore City called the Colored Methodist Society, which then gave rise to the Sharp Street Methodist Episcopal Church, today the Sharp Street United Methodist Church. And it was these early African Americans like Caleb Hyland and Jacob Forty, who were the early Black activists and were clergy, and really led the way to create a colored Methodist society in direct response to peaceful demonstrations and protests that they held in the church, the white church, that refused to really admit them and accept them as equal members of the church and what have you. And so they created their own independent Black church through the organization of the Colored Methodist Society of 1787. And you have heard perhaps of the Free African Society of 1787, which was in Philadelphia. And so all across the country, these different movements were happening, where African Americans were again leading peaceful demonstrations and protest, and were our early activists. And it's born largely out of the church in a very formal way. And it's no different in the case of our Morgan State University. So we can trace our lineage back to this 1787 date. Equally, it's important to understand that we trace our lineage to the Sharp Street Methodist Episcopal Church, as you've heard me speak to. And the Sharp Street Church was historically located downtown in Baltimore City near the Inner Harbor. And this was the first building that Sharp Street Church was able to build. And it was in 1802. And it's important to understand that those early leaders had a African school, and it's actually recorded on the deeds associated with this 1802 date. So even before there was a Morgan State University and a Centenary Biblical Institute of 1867, there was the formation of a African school that convened at this site in the early 1800s, again, as part of that work of the early Colored Methodist Society and etc. By the time the second church building was built in 1860, and this is where a Morgan State University through the Centenary Biblical Institute would begin to come in the basement of the church that's pictured here that was built in 1860, on the same site replacing that 1802 church that I just showed you. This is where then our visionary African-American founders of what would then become Morgan State University convened to create and author the founding mission of the institution, the moral and intellectual elevation, as part of a religious education committee. And they did this in 1864, convening right here in this building at the Sharp Street Church. And that was on the eve of Maryland's Emancipation Proclamation, to ensure that all African Americans in Maryland the very next day, that there would be a plan in order to have a institution of education at the higher level. Our journey as Morgan State University began very formally with that October 31, 1864 date of those 3 days of convening that they had leading up to the November 1st Emancipation Proclamation. And then our first classes were held there in that church. And we remained there at the Sharp Street Church until we were able to purchase the second location, which became the Peyton property for Morgan. And then on to Old West Baltimore, where most people start the history for Morgan, is at Edmondson and Fulton. You know, if you talk to a lot of Morgan alum, if you just hear about the history of Morgan, some people think that the history starts with the current and present site at Hillen and Cold Spring, but mostly people will know about Edmondson and Fulton. Very few people know about the Peyton property. Never even heard that name. That area is today Mercy Hospital. That's where Morgan was with its second location. It was an early Black community called Gallo Hills. But its first site was down at the Inner Harbor, Pratt and Lombard. And very few people know about that actual location. So Morgan's had a unique journey from becoming, again, the Centenary Biblical Institute of 1867 to becoming Morgan College in 1890, and thus very formally Maryland's first African-American four-year liberal arts college. So even though, you know, as I mentioned last time, Bowie State University's date predates our institution, Morgan became a four-year liberal arts college in the state of Maryland as the first of the four HBCUs. And then we were purchased by the state of Maryland in 1939, and I'm going to go into that as it relates to the chapel following these slides. And we became Morgan State College. And then in 1975, the state legislature elevated the status of the college to a university. And we have been Morgan State University since 1975. So in short, those are our key sort of institutional milestone dates. And many of you have seen those dates as they are listed on different medallions and what have you, and certainly chronicled through various convocations through the university. Very key individuals where many hands, not just Black hands, but white hands, not just Methodists, but also Quakers, and the list goes on in regards to those that aided in the establishment of our institution, Morgan State University. One such person that we uplifted in the last session as well, that's important to really understand, obviously, is the namesake, Reverend Littleton F. Morgan. And very few people are familiar with his history or have seen him in terms of an image, but certainly he was a clergy. He was Reverend Littleton Morgan, who had a doctorate in divinity. He was one of our trustees on the board of trustees, and he was the philanthropist who gave the money to Morgan State University in 1890, which was the equivalent of today $2.5 million in 1890. And so the institution rechristened the institution in his honor, naming it then Morgan College. And it also enabled us to become a four-year liberal arts college, transcending from the Centenary Biblical Institute, originally designed to train in the ministry, to being a full-on four-year liberal arts college. The current site, which is one that's unique and important to the overall history now of our institution, because it is the only surviving campus of all such campuses that we have. So in our last session, we reviewed them all, even our Lynchburg, Virginia, which was tied to the Jackson Street Church, our what is today the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. It was the Princess Anne Academy or the Delaware Conference Academy of Morgan College, and was connected to the Metropolitan Methodist Church. All of those were our branches, and those institutions are no longer affiliated with Morgan, and their respective original campuses are no longer in existence, if you will. And so the current campus is our only campus that survives. Downtown, the two downtown locations are no longer in existence, and the Edmondson and Fulton campus is no longer in existence. So for all intents and purposes, the Hillen and Cold Spring Lane property and campus is the only campus that speaks to the entirety of the history of what we now know to be Morgan State University. It also is the location where we have been Morgan College, Morgan State College, and Morgan State University. And so even through the evolution of the institution as we lead up to the chapel, it's important to understand that the role of the church was still intertwined with even the Hillen and Cold Spring Lane campus. Many of you are aware that certainly Baltimore was one of the earliest in the country and one of the most robust in the country with racial discrimination, racial residential segregation laws and discriminatory practices. And certainly this was no stranger to the Morgan campus and experience in the North Baltimore section where the campus is located. And so an original tract of that land was carved out to become a residential neighborhood. And the early and first resident of that community to build a house, send a signal that Morgan Park, as it is called, would be home to African Americans and would become an exclusive African American community, was none other than Reverend Dr. Pazavia O'Connell. And he was not only one of Morgan's earliest professors of history and also a former leader of the University of Maryland Eastern Shore when it was then under Morgan's control, but he was also a clergy, a part of the Black church experience and the Methodist Church that was all at the underpinning, if you will, of our institution. And his home still stands. And many of you know O'Connell through O'Connell Hall, our dormitory on the campus. You know O'Connell through his adopted daughter, Helen Roberts, and the Helen Roberts dining facility on campus that many have been able to dine at. So all of these connections, and then of course homes, and there are two homes to be critical of as part of this narrative, and that is Reverend John Holmes, who was the father of our president, Dr. Dwight Oliver Wendell Holmes. And Reverend John Holmes was a pastor of the Sharp Street Church from 1880 to 1883. So our first African-American president grew up in the Black church and grew up in the very church that was at the centrality of our Morgan experience, and later then would become the first Black president of the institution. Dr. Dwight Oliver Wendell Holmes is featured here. He's the gentleman on the right, and to his left is Dr. Martin David Jenkins, who was the second African-American president of Morgan State University. And of course, Dr. Holmes had a very critical role as being the first Black president, but also a critical role in sort of the establishment, not only of the campus, but also of the chapel. All of this falls under his particular presidential administration. And for those soulful centennials that are online, the class of 1967, this particular image obviously coincides with that 1967 era. This is a 1967 painting of the campus showing largely Dr. Holmes's vision being largely built out as Dr. Jenkins took the mantle and continued on with taking the college to a university level, if you will. Some of the really key individuals that were a part of this early establishment connected with both the church and the institution, of course, are Bishop William Alfred Carroll Hughes, which again, many know the name through the W.A.C. Hughes Stadium, which is where most of us as Morgan alum have graduated through our commencements on that very stadium, which was built in 1937 and named in honor of the bishop of the church, who also pastored the Sharp Street Church from 1905 to 1912 and was a Morgan graduate. The Reverend Dr. McHenry Jeremiah Naylor, another very important individual to this narrative, a Sharp Street Episcopal Church pastor from 1912 to 1921, but also the landowner of what was referred to as the Naylor Road property, which is where the chapel is actually constructed. It is on a different parcel, which you will see and learn was merged then with the university. And so Dr. Naylor was central to this establishment as well. The chapel itself, which was originally referred to, and we'll get into it, as the Morgan Christian Center, was built in 1941 and is celebrating, obviously, this year its 80th anniversary. And here are just some historic photographs quickly to look at before we delve deeper into it, in terms of when it was initially built and what the actual chapel, as far as the interior, looked like in 1941, and views then from the chapel over to the main quad in that same era, just to take you back to that experience. The chapel itself inside was named in honor of Susie Carr Love. And for many of those that are familiar with the history of the naming of buildings on the campus, rather, Susie Carr Love was Morgan's first female graduate. She graduated from the Institute, the Centenary Biblical Institute, in 1878. And she was one of the few women to have a building named in her honor. This is Susie Carr Love here, graduate 1878 rather, and she was also the mother of Bishop Edgar Amos Love, who was a bishop in the Methodist Church and also principal of the Morgan Academy, which is where we get one of the notable alumnus, Zora Neale Hurston of 1918, who became author and anthropologist. One of the other very important persons connected to this as well then is the Reverend Dr. Howard L. Cornish, who had a very prolific career with Morgan State University. He was a graduate of the Morgan College, rather, from 1927. And then he spent he spanned a career of 6 decades at Morgan, from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and to the 70s. And it's really important to understand how central his role was, both within the academy and the church, as far as him having a joint appointment as a professor of mathematics and then also director of the Morgan Christian Center. And he played, of course, a pivotal role and also the civil rights agenda associated with the chapel. Morgan, of course, being a national treasure, and Morgan's purpose tied to all of these important things and its progress over the years, the promise of Morgan, how the inheritance goes into all of these aspects that we'll talk about, and then the stewardship of Morgan are all very important to how then the Morgan State University Memorial Chapel evolves and becomes a significant fabric to what we now call Morgan State University. And there are a couple really important highlights here to look at that are important to understand as we now unpack, if you will, this part 2 component of understanding the role of the chapel. This timeline will help break down some of the very critical dates in the overall timeline of the chapel. It's first important to understand that the chapel proper is really sort of precipitated by a 1935 event where Donald Gaines Murray, a Black resident of Maryland, was initially refused admittance into the University of Maryland Law School and filed a lawsuit charging racial discrimination. This early event began to reshape the climate, if you will, of the higher education system in Maryland. At the same time, a federal judge, Morris A. Soper, and many of us remember the name Soper from the various Soper libraries. And unfortunately, Soper's name is no longer attached to any such building, but it's important for us to understand that Judge Morris Soper and his legacy is central to the chapel and also to the experience of Morgan State University. He was also a chairman of Morgan College Board of Trustees. He served on Morgan's Board of Trustees from 1919 to 1953. He was Caucasian. However, he was a chairman of the Maryland State Commission on Higher Education of Negroes. He was considered a civil rights activist And in fact, even connected to my own discipline in architecture, he was the first judge in America to award admittance to a Black architecture student to be able to go to a white school and study architecture, which is separate from Morgan, but certainly you can just see the magnitude of a Judge Morris Soper who was connected to Morgan. It was this sort of agency that really paved the way for Morgan College to become Morgan State College, because his serving on that Morgan State, or rather Maryland State Commission on Higher Education of Negroes, really laid out the blueprint for the conversion of Morgan College to Morgan State College. In 1937, as we've looked at Dr. Dwight Oliver Wendell Holmes, he was inaugurated as the first African-American president of Morgan College. And then Morgan College, still a private Methodist institution at this time, remained as such until 1939. At the conclusion of the State Commission on Higher Education of Negroes, this 1939 date became central to Morgan's history. It is when the state of Maryland, as a result of both the 1935 Donald Gaines Murray case, which was a discriminatory case of an African-American being a resident and not being able to go to the University of Maryland, and Maryland not having a public Black institution, and then having this Maryland State Commission on Higher Education of Negroes begin to lay out the blueprint and the roadmap accordingly. The state of Maryland purchased Morgan as a private institution, as a private Methodist institution. Very important to understand, 1867 to 1939, Methodist, the church. And it officially became a public institution in 1939 in direct response to the statewide study that determined that the state needed to provide more opportunities to Black citizens. This really gives rise to what we would call a center of faith in civil rights activism, because during these critical times, the chapel is being very formally established, and Morgan, through its students and others, are embarking upon its most significant civil rights agenda and developing its most significant civil rights activism legacy over the course of those years. On September 28, 1938, in particular, the Board of Trustees of Morgan College approved the transfer of the state of Maryland under the condition that the state would maintain an institution of higher learning for Blacks that offered a curriculum equivalent in quality to the curricula offered at the University of Maryland. From those proceeds, and this is something to really accentuate because this is very, very, very significant, from the proceeds of the 1939 state purchase, which was the transaction that converted a private Methodist school to a public institution that was referred to then as Morgan State College of 1939. This is how significant the transaction was. The proceeds were earmarked for the construction of a center for religious activities, the Morgan Christian Center, now the Morgan State University Memorial Chapel. Those same proceeds were used to create and establish a parsonage, a residential structure that was built directly aside the chapel. Unfortunately, it is no longer with us, formerly referred to as the Reverend Howard L. Cornish Residence as well. And then the third thing that was used with those funds was an endowment. That's how significant that transaction was. Not only a conversion from private institution to public, but a setup of infrastructure that not only would send a signal that Morgan's religious roots would be preserved, but it would also create the bricks and mortar to officially do that. And look at the lens now whereby the chapel's 80 years, 8 decades, has given rise to a lot of the civil rights activities that we'll be able to look at and many of us are aware of, and to the different leaders that were also produced as a result of it, and those that were at the helm of shaping it. And so this effort preserved those early roots tied to the Black church, from the Centenarian Biblical Institute of 1867 to then the Morgan College to Morgan State College as it transitioned from a private college to a future as a state institution. And then the next very significant date following all of that would have been then 2008. And I think that this is why there's little knowledge, if you will, about the history, the role, and the centrality of the chapel, or some called it the church, and others called it the Christian Center, and others just didn't know what it was altogether as they walked by it or heard about it. And it's because in 2008, the Morgan Christian Center trustees then deeded this property to Morgan State University. So just to try to clarify this and make it very clear, the Morgan Christian Center, which is which was, if you will, what is today the chapel, was never a parcel or a building that was owned by Morgan State University. Because again, as you're saying in this timeline, it's very important to understand that proceeds from a private sale to a public state institution were used to purchase the grounds from a Black pastor at Sharp Street, were used to erect a building then on a site that was owned by the Morgan Christian Center Board of Trustees. And so while it was amidst the campus, it was not physically a part of the campus, nor was it owned by the state of Maryland until 2008. The chapel today is owned by the state of Maryland, thus Morgan State University. And so, you know, this I believe really has often caused a lot of confusion. You know, or I thought it was always a part of the university, or is it not a part of the university? Some aren't aware that it is a part of the university today. And so not only was it renamed as part of this aspect, but this is where we get Reverend Dr. Bernard Keels, who was also then named the director of the chapel as part of this 2008 date and experience, and is now the inaugural dean of the chapel. And so these dates and these events are extremely important to the context of the establishment of the university's chapel. And again, Judge Morris A. Soper, who is the very tall white gentleman in the photograph, centered here in the middle, shaking the hand of Morgan's second African-American president, Dr. Martin David Jenkins. Judge Soper, a federal judge, a noted civil rights activist, was chairman of the Board of Trustees under the private institution and was chairman of the trustees under the then public institution. He presided on both sides. He was the Morgan College chairman of the Board of Trustees, and then became the chairman of the Morgan State College Board of Trustees, and was also very integral in this transaction of the formation of the chapel, and even presided over its construction. Dr. Dwight Oliver Wendell Holmes, similarly, obviously, very central to this experience. He was the president, but he also has a very unique experience to how the architect was selected. A very significant African-American architect was selected to design the building, and it was a former student of Dr. Dwight Oliver Wendell Holmes when he was then a teacher at the historic Frederick Douglass High School in Baltimore City. One of his former high school students went on to become a very noted architect that I will show you and discuss. And of course, Dr. Holmes was integral in pulling that architect in to be central to the design of this new facility. And I should also give credit to Dr. Carl J. Murphy, who was the then president of the Afro newspaper, who became a charter member of the Morgan State College Board of Trustees in 1939. And he also was intimately intertwined with this architect because the architect had designed his house in Morgan Park. And so all of these little connections were all intertwined with the experience of the chapel. And then, of course, Reverend Dr. McHenry Jeremiah Naylor sold the actual Naylor Road property to the Morgan Christian Center Board of Trustees in 1939. So he owned the land that the chapel, the then parsonage, was situated on, and was integral to the experience. This is Albert Cassell, the Black architect that was selected to design this new chapel and parsonage to be erected as part of this 1939 state purchase proceeds. Again, the beloved chapel and what it looked like in 1941 as a part of that overall experience. And then, of course, one of the central persons very early in the chapel's history to this would then be Dr. Howard L. Cornish. He was not the first director. Certainly we'll talk about that briefly, but he certainly became the director 3 years after the establishment of the building, and was one of its long-standing directors from 1944 to 1976. Very, very important to understand that all of this serves sort of as the backdrop to understand the history and the role of the chapel. I have a clip here of the oracle, which was, an official organ of the Omega Psi Phi fraternity. And of course, Dr. Cornish was a member of this and was a Q and so forth. And in this, it also highlights from 1946 the importance of the Morgan Christian Center as the culmination of the ideals, dreams, and visions of the founders of the Centenary Biblical Institute, which then obviously became Morgan State University. And over the course of this, there have been several directors. The first director preceding Dr. Cornish was Dr. John Jarvis Seabrook. And then I'm providing a list of those that then went on to lead after Dr. Cornish. Many of the names most of you will remember and also know, of course, like the Dr. Richard McKinney, who we talked about a little bit in the last session, and Dr. Doug Sands, and of course, Dr. Marion Bascom, Dr. Richard Adams, up to our own Dean, Reverend Bernard Keels. The architect being very significant to this experience to understand is that they selected, as I said, Albert Cassell. Albert Cassell was one of the nation's first Black architects. He was the 8th to be registered in America. He was born in Towson, Maryland, and he went on to go to Frederick Douglass High School and then graduated from there and went to Cornell University. And he is the most celebrated early African-American architect in the nation. He's the only one who had inspired his children and his grandchildren to become architects. He had 4 of his children become architects, which is significant, 2 of which were women, and then 2 of his granddaughters became architects. And it's very important for persons to understand how significant that is when even today, Black architects represent less than 2% of all architects. And so he has a remarkable legacy. He designed a number of buildings on various HBCU campuses. He designed nearly all of Howard University and was their chief architect and master planner. He designed a number of buildings across the nation as well. The chapel itself, we began documenting as the School of Architecture and Planning, and I led a contingent of students to really begin to chronicle the history and also begin to address the preservation measures of the chapel. And the chapel had really became one of the leading buildings on the campus to galvanize the support of the overall university to preserve other historic buildings on the campus, and really was one of the buildings that, through the Friends of the Chapel and many others, became one of the main movements leading to a major preservation agenda that would lead to ultimately the designation of a national treasure, the designation of the chapel as a historic building on the National Register of Historic Places. You'll see here, I have a little quote with no real time to read, but it is the acceptance of the keys which Judge Morris Soper delivered or rather accepted from the architect, Albert Cassell, on December 16, 1941, which is the 80th anniversary of the chapel itself. When we first started working around the chapel very formally in 2010 to address some of its preservation measures in partnership with Dean Keels and the Friends of the Chapel and the university, the chapel had fallen into quite a deplorable condition. And many alum and others were, quite concerned about, our beloved chapel, not only its history, as we've just gone over, and persons not being aware of it, but also just the building itself. At this point, the building was now owned by Morgan State University, as of 2008, and this was 2010. And it was an early effort really to get the university to understand that now it needed to, cut the grass. The lawn belonged to the university. It needed to maintain the actual building. And so we worked together, as the chapel with the university and the Friends with administration and et cetera, to embark upon one of the first really restoration efforts on the campus. All of this predated the National Treasure. It predated us being listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And so on one hand, while we look at, demonstrations and petitions and sit-ins and other aspects of activism, it's important to understand the role of preservation and preservation as an activist agenda. And certainly we engaged, yet again, our students in that movement, coupled with alum and also Morgan faculty and staff. The chapel has still yet all of its original features from 1941. And when we were embarking upon this, as I mentioned in 2010, this is one of the images of what the chapel looked like. And of course, its entry, some may recall, was being temporarily shored by structural members to hold the arcaded entrance up, because it had been sort of neglected. We were moving to sort of raise the public's awareness and attention and appreciation towards getting the chapel preserved and getting the appropriate resources to, maintain and preserve the chapel. It has all of the original windows and doors, which are things that may not be very common to some of the other buildings that are on the campus as they've been modernized and improved. And then again, this early entrance into the chapel, as you could see, its roof, the original slate roof. We had students working in this building, even in its attic spaces of the chapel. We worked on the roof of the chapel. We were in every room of this chapel. It was a real honor to be able to document and reinvigorate all of the historic elements that Albert Irving Cassell, its founding architect, and his significant legacy, as I was mentioning, even on with his own children, that went into this building. In fact, this is the early sketch from Albert Cassell, featured in the Baltimore Afro, showing what he had initially intended for the chapel to look like. And it looks very much like its early sketch from 1940. And it was recorded as one of Morgan's first buildings to cost $100,000, which in 1940 was a lot of money. And certainly this building was intended to have all of the elements that it does in fact have today, such as its chapel, which seats 230 plus persons, and rooms to have classes, and in the lower level of the chapel, all parts of the chapel were fully programmed at that time. In the earlier histories of the chapel, and this is 1949, the freshman classes would convene in the chapel. And this is Dr. Martin David Jenkins speaking as the president to the students who were convened in the chapel on the campus. The chapel, as we said, played a very instrumental role in the civil rights agendas from the 40s all the way up to the 60s. And these are images from those different experiences, including the Spite Wall. The former was in Annapolis, the sit-in at the Reed's drugstore, the protest over at Northwood, all of the sort of civil rights movements from the 40s to the 60s that are chronicled in our student center, all had some sort of early movements were born out of the chapel and the parsonage, which was seen as a civil rights house in a sense. When President Wilson joined the institution and was inaugurated, and in 2011 in particular, he went about a major movement to revitalize the campus. And this is where, again, the chapel and friends of the chapel and the role of the chapel became instrumental in the sort of reimagining and preserving, if you will, of the campus proper. And this became a very significant movement where President Wilson gave the initial $200,000 to the chapel to preserve it. There was a bid that was put out by the university initially to actually begin demolishing parts of the chapel. And we were able to locate this, get out in front of this, and convince and work with the institution that preservation was what we needed to embark upon. And President Wilson agreed. And as I said, he committed and gave $200,000, which kicked off the project. And we went hand in glove with President Wilson and the university administration, with the chapel, Friends of the Chapel rather, and many others, to begin to list it on the National Register, working with the city and the state and all the way up to the federal government to preserve the chapel, getting our students involved again, to be integral in documenting it and getting it listed and working to preserve the chapel. And they made many presentations to the administration and alumni to preserve it. And so we began the work to restore our chapel, not only in bricks and mortar, but also to reinvigorate the role and the relevancy of the chapel. You can see images here of how the state of the chapel, from broken slate on the roof to its initial arcaded entrance, all of that work we began together, and it began to serve as a catalyst for the other works that would then become very important on Morgan's campus to preserve other buildings, and ultimately would reposition us as an institution to be elevated to one of the highest levels, which would be then to be named a national treasure in 2016. So I'm going very fast and making things kind of short. It's very long, but nevertheless, the chapel was at the helm of us getting to a 2016 designation of a national treasure and preservation. Us being able to get funds from the state of Maryland and through its African American Heritage Preservation Grant Program, the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The chapel was at the helm of Morgan becoming the first HBCU in America to have a preservation and practice program in partnership with the federal agencies designed to diversify African Americans in the field of preservation. And it, of course, was at our very chapel where we held that piloted program to begin to restore the original windows of the chapel as Albert Irvin Cassell had originally designed, and as the administration of the institution at that time had originally envisioned this chapel to be constructed. And so our students from Morgan State University and the School of Architecture and Planning were able to put their hands literally to history and be able to restore the chapel. It gained a lot of attention, not only from our own president, but from various media outlets, including the Post and the Sun. It also garnered the attention of the Black billionaire Robert Smith, who gave the money to the Morehouse students. He has now become a contributor to this program. It gave a platform to our Black students who are very rare in the field of preservation, a field that is mainly white male and men that are white and over 50 years old. And so our young Black students being involved in doing this kind of work is very important. And they are at the helm of a new national movement of addressing this. They won the 2019 award from preservation. And we also won very recently, where Dean Keels and I are working with the National Park Service and our institution. We were one of few HBCUs to get a National Park Service HBCU grant of $500,000 to begin to further restore the institution. And so the chapel has become a very, very, very important place in the history and evolution of our institution. And every opportunity that we get now, of course, we seek to continue to educate persons about just how significant the chapel was, the chapel is, and the chapel can be. And so I hope that through these two sessions, part one and part two, it's provided an opportunity for persons to unpack that overall historical legacy, to understand its impact even today, as I showed, how it is still continuing to advance our overall institution, moral and intellectual elevation. And so with that, I'm going to open the floor for questions and comments and to be able to address you accordingly.
Any questions? Let me jumpstart it in by simply saying that the
Oh, you're on mute, Dean Kills.
unmuted now, right? Yep.
Yes.
Yes.
As an onus upon the chapel to be able to look at the issue of spiritual development as it relates to not just quote unquote religion, but the juxtaposition of the peoples of the world. The events of the last couple of days in America speak volumes to how clearly important it is that we understand that there has to be a prima facie spiritual acumen for us to move forward as a society. One of the things that I looking back and feeling quite old, I realize I've been here since 2008, is that none of this was by accident. When you look around and see where we go from here, things like this podcast, the Sunday evening services, the working with feeding my sheep, the working with the instruction of the chaplains and the various groups is very important. But the next step really has to be about connecting with the entire university to realize there's nothing to be ashamed of in terms of our history and where we are. So many times that we evolve into the modern era and we forget who brought us to the dance. I wish sometimes that on this particular Insightful Foundation, one of the founders from 1867 would just appear and talk to us. What would they say? What would they know that their grandchildren caught the spirit and are here to be able to give living testimony to it? What would they say when they found out there were faculty members who are beginning to understand the critical importance of reaching beyond just the obvious? I don't believe in my spirit that there's going to be a future in higher education for any people unless they have an understanding of just how critically important it was. People of color have been in this industry, in this institution for this over 150 years. Imagine what we could achieve in 250 years. We won't be here to give that testimony, but I think that the Samuel Greens and the Bishop Waymans knew they would not be here to hear the testimony of 2021. So I implore you to just keep spreading the word about what it is we're trying to do. Don't be discouraged. There's a train coming, and it's time to get on board. It's time to realize that there's a very limited window of what you can achieve via your skills. All of you are incredible academicians, incredible human beings with the volumes of gifts and evidence of God's grace. What would be said about the sacrifices that we make 30 years from now? I shudder to think about how they would describe what happened January 6th to history students 10, 15 years from now. It's more than what we ever realized that happened. No one had any idea in 1867 the Seminary Biblical Institute would not be a national treasure. From trash to treasure. only because people put their sweat, their tears, their spirit, and their gifts into it. I just want to open that up as a beginning for a conversation.
I think that leads me to the question, um, any of this information is part of a curriculum in the history for the students at Morgan, so they will have this information and then move on with it? Because as Reverend Keel said, we need to know, the students need to know um, where we've come from so that we can do what we need to do in the present and just take that and move forward. It's a legacy, but this has been fantastic. The information presented, and as they say, you're never too old to learn. I've learned a lot in part one and part two.
Well, kudos goes to Dale Green, and he's very modest about this. In
Yeah.
2008 or 9, his graduate class on historic preservation met weekly at the chapel.
Okay.
That's how the whole idea of the restoration of history began from his eyes.
Yeah.
I remember thinking, like, I've not seen teaching at this level before. To see students all of a sudden going up into the attic and measuring all the things and documenting the building, and it made learning become living. And then God opened the door a few years later on the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies for me to teach a course on the Black church.
Mhm.
Part of the course that I teach is talking about the HBCU as part of the significance of the Black church. I've helped my students understand that in 1867, 9 institutions were founded primarily through the church experience. You'd be surprised how many of our students don't know that Howard and Morehouse and different places were all, Barbara Scotia College, were all founded by religious organizations. So that, yes, it's being done. The sad thing is that it's not being done at the level and extent to which it can be done.
Mhm.
Some places like a Notre Dame or some of the Catholic universities, as an integral part of their curricula, never allow their students to forget where they came from. And they began to talk very much about that. So, and then you have the kind of far right evangelical places like Liberty University, et cetera, that are spewing their theology. But yes, it does need to become part of what we do. And hopefully that will emerge too through people, like Dr. Holland and Clarence Wayman, who were chaplains at the chapel, who were teaching and connecting with students in a real way, that are really helping them begin to realize that they're more than just at HBCU step show. They're at HBCU step back in history. To know that someone who didn't have shoes maybe did those first steps. Someone who didn't have a sense of a history of a family going to college. And a lot of our students now are first generation college students. So it's easily to help them begin to understand the similarities, if you will, with the 1864 discussions and the 2021 discussions.
Let's thank Dr. Green. Give him his kudos now.
I'd like
That's
to,
right.
Thank you.
Excellent job. Thank
Yes. Yes. Bravo. Bravo.
Thank you.
brother. Yeah, I would like to follow up with my classmate's observation, Cameron Greenhill. And one of the things I think that this presentation proves to us and demonstrates to us, is the importance of preservation in preserving our history. That's the physical preservation of our structures, because throughout African American, Black America, we found that many of our historic resources have been destroyed, gone into disrepair, and really are not known about. So I'd like to commend Professor Green, on this initiative with the chapel, and I'm delighted to have been a part of this experience as an old, as a member of the Friends of the Chapel. But the history is important. It's so important that we preserve that history. I still stress over the loss of the chapel, of the parsonage, as many of you, are aware. We fought very hard to make sure that that building was also preserved because it is an integral part of this history, as Professor Green has demonstrated. So with all of those who are assembled, and I see Mrs. Marshall, who is on the African American Commission, you know, we must be aware throughout our city and throughout the state of being activists when it comes to preservation throughout Maryland and throughout the nation. I said about the chapel's parsonage, once it's gone, it's gone. You can't bring it back. So it's incumbent on all of us to really become activists in our own communities and in our own right to make certain that when we see these opportunities aimed at preserving our historic monuments, our historic treasures, even at Morgan, there's no guarantee, you know, that other actions may take place where our buildings are in jeopardy. So I implore all of us to be activists in our own right to preserve our history. And Ms. Greenhill is absolutely right. That preservation opportunity, those opportunities begin with our students. They must be trained to be activists and to be aware of all of our history and the obligation we have to make sure that we have those, because there's something about a visualization, about visualizing monuments that help us to understand at a greater level our history. Thank you, Professor Green.
Yeah.
Dr. Green, hi, my name is Daisha Demo. Hello, Dr. Kills, Reverend Kills. I was a student who frequently seeked help and just a prayer from Dr. Kills, and Mr. Warren was also someone that I was able to talk to. And so as a student and as an alum in my own class, I always reference to my students what the chapel meant to me. And pardon me for just abruptly coming, but I actually have to go back to class. And I was so happy when I was aware that the chapel was going to stay and it was going to be there. And at any given moment, any time I had, I would always try to volunteer. So I just want to thank you all for all the good work. For a student like me who needed the chapel as a place of refuge and safety, whatever personal and spiritual things that I was going through. And the chapel was always a place to help me, remind me of my purpose and why I was at Morgan. And so thank you all. And some of you who may have paid a book or two. So thank you, and we're doing well. And so I'm sorry to just leave, but I just wanted to let the alumni know and everyone that we may not hear some of the voices from the young alum because there is a disconnect. But those of us who came through the chapel through 2011 and 15, through that transitional phase, the chapel was a very vital piece in not only our spiritual growth, but our matriculation as we grew into professionals. All right, have a good day, everyone.
You
Too.
agree?
Thank you.
I would
You
agree
too.
teacher as well.
That was great. That was great.
Yeah.
Yes, it was. Appreciate
Thank
you.
Deja.
All right, I just had to come in really quickly. I was late and I was like on my lunch and then I have class. I saw it on Instagram and like, I was like, oh, like, is this old? Is this new? And so I hit the little link and then it was like register and then I freaked out. So I was like, oh my gosh.
You did it. You did it. Tell your friends.
Right.
Yeah.
All right.
Tell your associates and your family.
Great
Okay.
testimony. Great testimony.
Yes.
Thank
Oh,
you all.
yes.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Professor Green, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I just want to follow up, and also a question that was asked by Ms. Greenhill as far as the information being taught at the university. Are you aware of, or is there a possibility, because we have an archivist's office, we have a Department of History.
Yes.
Could there be some type of collaboration between that office, the history office, and your area to put together that history of Morgan along with the chapel, but also just Morgan's history? Because I'm, as an employee and alumni of this university, I'll just say it. I don't want for us to be so consumed with the feel-good talk about diversity that we lose who we are, and our history becomes not even a footnote, but something that is only talked about in the shadows when it comes time for us to ask people for money. So how do we, if possible, bring those offices and locations together so that we can formalize the university's history? Because one of the reasons that there's a disconnect between students who have graduated from the university after 1976 and those prior to 1976, the Morgan Pride issue is lacking. And if our students knew the full history of the university, and that would instill some pride, and they would be more willing to give, especially as alumni, because they would see the value in what they have while they were here. So I don't know if there's a possibility that could be done. And maybe that could be a project that the Friends of the Chapel could also help to spear, because the history for future generations. So again, we don't become lost in this pool of diversity. And, you know, next thing you know, ain't too many of us walking around on campus without being too politically incorrect.
Yeah, let me respond to what you said, and thank you for bringing that question to the floor. You've brought up important and appropriate departments. Dr. Edwin Johnson is not here with us, but he is a member of the Friends of the Chapel, and he is the assistant university archivist, as you know, and of course, Dr. Jones is in, Ida Jones is in there as well, and she is the university archivist. And the university archives, I should say, and we don't, you know, of course, all of us that are here that are Morgan and pro Morgan, you know, I just want to make sure I state that so nothing's taken the wrong way as well. But it is important to understand that there's a lot that we are still institutionalizing, because in talking about the university archives, many persons are unaware that the university archives and that effort, which Mr. Howells can attest to, also was a part of this activism experience, because Morgan did not have an official office of the university archives or a archivist. And so we could spend a lot of time talking about the different things that need to still happen, but we also want to be mindful that just like we look through many lenses today, and even the last time, this is an evolution and it is still yet a journey, and being activists is essential. You know, I lifted up that proverb, right? When we pray, and we certainly need much prayer, we then must move with our feet. As you said, it's not enough to just talk about diversity and inclusion in our history, but then we're not taking the measures to ensure that our history is not only preserved, but it is alive and is informing what it is that we are doing. And so each step along the way, each of us are still active and trying to ensure that that happens. And so we do now have a university archivist and an assistant and an office. You mentioned history. The Morgan State University Department of History started with Reverend Dr. Xavier O'Connell that we just talked about today. That was in the early 1900s. And then we had one of the foremost African-American historians, big precursor to a Dr. Henry Louis Gates, in the name of our own Morgan State University, Dr. Benjamin Arthur Quarles, Dr. Roland McConnell. And yet our history department, that's why I said we pro Morgan, I'm not throwing darts. Our history department, we have to continue to work together to ensure that the history department understands its history fully. It understands the history of the institution fully, and understands what we need to do within the history department and within its faculty and its students and the university to ensure that, as persons talked about and you talked about, not only Morgan's pride, but Morgan's legacy, Morgan's courses, whether convocation, whatever the case is, we need to be very serious about this. And then, as you mentioned, as far as the students and the faculty and just infrastructure in general. You know, I was happy and sad that the sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary was a great success. Happy. Sad that the last time something like that happened was the centennial, which is when Mr. Howells and many of his colleagues were graduating in 1967. And so we can't go 50 years doing what it is that we can do every year, not at the same level and scale, but at the same time, more people learned about the history and the significance. When I say people, I don't just mean Morgan. The world learned about the role of Morgan through the sesquicentennial. We have to every day ensure that we're doing what it is that we can do, and we can do it. We're Institute of Higher Learning. That's what we're doing every day. We need to ensure that we are taking that to the fullest extent, particularly when it comes to our founding and its role and its relevancy, because as for some people, history is just history. Oh, that was when it was founded. But that's not all that it is when you understand what it is doing today, even outside of a Morgan State University. When we talked about what just happened at the Capitol, you know, it's not just history. It's how history continues to guide people, pro or con, good or bad, and we need to understand its role. We need to understand it. And so we have to formalize those courses. There are courses on the books for students to take to learn Morgan's history. Are they offered every semester? No.
Okay.
Is there a history of Morgan written? Yes. There's a history that was written by the registrar, who wrote the 1867, wrote the history from 1867 to 1967. And then we picked up that history following 1967 to 2017 as part of this sesquicentennial. And so Edward Wilson, who was the registrar, was the one who wrote the only formal publication, which is a book and also is in the university archives and so forth, on the history. And then through Mr. Howells, myself, Dr. Johnson, Dr. Bernie Hollis, and many others, we picked up last 50 years, picking up 67 to 2017 as part of the sesquicentennial, because there hadn't been a completion. And that's when we pulled out, lo and behold, who our African-American visionary founders were. Because the previous history, as you could imagine, being written years ago, was one that wasn't necessarily inclusive of all of the contributions of African-Americans. And so a lot of contributions were given to the white Methodist Church prior to the sesquicentennial. And we didn't even, quote unquote, know that we had African-Americans like Reverend Samuel Green, Reverend James Harper, Reverend Benjamin Brown, and Reverend James Peck, and Reverend Elijah Grissom, who were the Black African-American founders of Morgan State University, who were under a veil of anonymity. They were nameless, they were faceless, but we brought light to all of that. And that's what 1 year can do. And that's why your question is so important. Look at what each day could do. That spring session, fall session, summer session, you know, and so, you know, it's a great question, but it is controversial, as you know, and it shouldn't be, but it is. And a lot of what we've talked about is even more so, because in our last session, we talked about that there are those that have still a separation of church and state belief, and they refuse to have the right conversations about not only the Black church, but the Morgan State University Memorial Chapel. Even when I referenced earlier, if you heard me, and I said, we had to work with the administration to cut the grass of the lawn at the chapel. That was not a joke. There were people like, we can't cut that grass with state money. I mean, so these are, you know, we have to be honest with ourselves and about ourselves in order to move forward. And it's a very important movement that we can all be a part of.
And just last, real quick, if I could add, there's another African proverb: until lions have their own historians, tell the hunt will always glorify the hunter.
All right. All right. Yeah.
I like that. The trouble a lot of time with academicians is that we reach a point in which we think we don't need to learn or to stimulate our mind anymore. Nowhere is that more evident in theological understanding. As a Methodist, lifelong Methodist, coming to Morgan to me was a culmination of growing up in AME Zion Church and recognizing how that became an offshoot of the Methodist Episcopal Church. But in 1939, the critical thing that was done was that to create a college that had the same offerings as the University of Maryland. And what racism and neglect does is that it produces a historic case that we've been dealing with now in terms of trying to make sure there's parity. You can never give up or slack up on your effort to keep thinking and learning. A wise person realizes that wisdom doesn't have an end. It simply has a stimuli that takes you to the next great thing that's going to be. We talked about, Paris and I, they talked about the fact of, as Methodists, we really need to understand how critically important it was that what happened in 1784 at Lovely Lane, and what happened at the George Street Methodist Church when Richard Allen and Absalom Jones were denied a place to pray must always be remembered, because had it not been for those bold visionaries, the colored Methodist society probably would not have existed to the fervor that it did. And now what I think it does is it doesn't talk about exclusivity of race. It talks about inclusivity. And until everybody's story is known, nobody's story becomes ultimately valid. And the struggle today is, as you look around mainline Protestant churches, is that they're still trying to do things like anti-racism, when the reality is there's so much pride we can have in a Morgan State college, Morgan State University. We should be telling this story everywhere and to be unashamed of knowing that a national treasure emerged from basically a national sin. Slavery is a sin that has not, and as of yet, been rectified in terms of the apologeticism that needs to be brought forward. There is no restorative justice unless there's an acknowledgement of what we've done in the past. And that's been my lifelong struggle as an academician, is trying to be able to understand what next, oh Lord. And again, you know, the Warren Houses of the world, who I also just simply admire for what you all did in 1967, and the Seymour Chambers, the same thing. Both Warren and Seymour are past presidents of the Student Association at Morgan. I don't find that coincidental. I find that very, very relevant that the two of you are still plugged into what we're doing, so that, you know, be encouraged. You know, realize that if we're going to be able to take this project forward, we've got to always consult one another. We've got to always do as my kindergarten teacher told me. She said, don't be ever afraid to show and tell. You remember show and tell when you were young? You bring something, explain what it was. And I used to really get a kick out of telling people the first time I knew I believed in God. I've been trying to tell that story for ever since I was about 8 years old. And it's incumbent upon us to show and tell the story of this, not only this chapel, but this university, because it's the Dale Greens of the world. At a really, you know, young age, they get to understand this. He's also was the first one of the student members of the Morgan Christian Center Board of Trustees. Imagine being plugged in from that as a student, now being a faculty member and still having that vision. That's just pretty extraordinary. What a time. Anyone have any closing comments? We got about 5 minutes or more. We can take Michelle.
Commissioner and Mr. Howell's question.
Reverend Keels, Sylvia Proctor has a question for you. She can't come in, so I'm gonna let her ask it through my phone.
Okay.
Sylvia, go ahead.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello.
You did an excellent job again. I was of the impression that as a part of orientation for new students at Morgan, that in fact there is now a part of that orientation is the history of Morgan State. Do you know whether or not that's still the case? I was told this back in around like 2013, 14, something like that.
Yes, there is a component of the freshman orientation that incorporates the history of Morgan. That is correct.
Because I've had a couple of students tell me that they didn't realize how they are entering an institution or part of an institution that has such a history. So that's why I want to make sure we were at least aware that at least that much is being done.
That is correct. That is correct. And I think, as I was saying as well, while that is a step in the right direction, and that certainly, is a newer effort as well, and it's important, it's not sufficient. It doesn't capture all of the students, number one. It is a very short time frame in which that history is shared, and all of us have been students, and we know what that's like. That doesn't send a signal that it's meaningful, significant. It's something we expect you to remember through 4 years and so on. And so,
Right.
but to acknowledge it does happen.
Should be more of a springboard for them to want to enroll in the full-fledged course.
Mhm,
Right.
mhm. Yep, exactly.
That's right.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. We'll talk later.
As I to the presentation, it was excellent, Professor Green. Really enjoyed it. I mean, every time you talk, I enjoy, your knowledge and all of that. It reminded me of the Adinkra symbol, Sankofa, and the Sankofa bird looks back and takes those nuggets to move forward. And I really appreciated that, just the courage, the tenacity, of these forefathers and foremothers. I didn't hear anything about women, but I'm sure that they were there as well, that were part of this. And as someone who is involved in family and consumer sciences, we are the people-centered profession. And I was thinking, how could I get this to my students? Because in that history, we know that there were families, there were people, there were children that were impacted by that. And I'm trying to, think about what I will do with my students so that we bring that lens, as we look at the history of what went on. How do you think that impacted the family, the Black family? How can we speak to that? Do those issues still exist today? So I'm thinking that it's something I will put into my curriculum in my classes and make it a requirement that the students look at these videos and then we have conversation about it. Because I think some of the issues that were dealt with then, or the needs, are still true today. And the whole thing about the spirituality of life, it's not just the book knowledge or whatever, it's bringing that spirit into it. And what does that look like, for the wholeness of the family and the individuals in the community? So I'm looking forward to really, applying some of these things with my students.
Excellent. And I love your, remarks, because you go into another angle. And that's why we say this is why this is so important, I think, for it to be discussed on so many levels, because as we talk about it, you start to see other tentacles. You start to see how it can go trans disciplines and so forth and what have you. And you brought up a very good point about the women, because as I started earlier on, I was careful to say race men and race women. And one of the things that we need to do more is to have a special lens of looking at the race women, because there were many race women in the history of Morgan, and that could be a separate special component in and of itself. And then you brought up another very important facet, which is the families. And certainly that is a very significant piece. And we hardly get into that component, because we always just in and of ourselves, we look at people sometimes as the person, and we forget that they are a part of a family, if not having their own family. And we don't look at it like that. And so that's another very important piece. And when it comes to Morgan, it's like, you hear us say Morgan men, Morgan women, but there's also Morgan families. And it's important to understand that history, not just current, not just so-and-so, their mother, their father, their niece, and their nephews working at Morgan today, but it's understanding those Morgan families, quote unquote, that were at the centrality of the founding and the continuation. And so I would love to see you certainly taking up that mantle, as it is very much appropriate within the context of your department. And that's why I say each day, each year, each department, each school, each alumni, whatever the case, all of us have some component in this narrative because we are a part of its tapestry. And it's not just Morgan in that you're a graduate, you're a faculty member or a staff person or this, that, and the other. I mean, when you look at the founding of Morgan, it involved so many people that are outside of those that we would think to connect to Morgan. So I just think that it's a very monumental opportunity for us to be able to, really take on different facets of this collectively.
Will we have access to this PowerPoint? Can we have
Yes.
access to this PowerPoint? Thank you.
Yeah, in fact, as you know, this was recorded, and so this both sessions are on YouTube. This one will go up on YouTube. Obviously, the other one I think has already gone up, and so this is still yet shareable. So even though there are those of us that are here, those that are not here are able to still see this, hear this, so forth, and what have you. So it will be publicly accessible.
Excellent.
May
Excellent.
I add one point,
Warren?
Dr. Holland, what she said, one of the most powerful documents I was able to view was from the Morgan Bulletin with some of the fundraising efforts for Morgan. And the churches in the Delaware and Washington Conference sponsored a campaign called A Prayer a Day, a Penny a Week, which was aimed at raising money to match the gift which was given to the university, the college, to build Carnegie Hall. And fortunately, in those records of the minutes of the Delaware and the Washington Conference, names are listed. And Professor Holland, you'll see in that names of women and men who contributed those pennies, dollars. And I think that's an extremely important revelation. It was for me, that the faith of these families, these women, these men who prayed every day and came up with a penny a week is astounding to me, to think about that as a sacrifice. I think about the widow's, what's it called, Reverend Keels? The widow's mite.
Widow's mite.
So here you have all of these people with pennies coming forth. What a powerful legacy we stand on. So when I give my few dollars and I think about what these ancestors of ours did in making this sacrifice. So families were certainly involved in this because can you imagine sacrificing a penny, the impact that had on the needs of individuals and families? So, the more we talk about this legacy, the more profound it becomes. And I think that it's important that, as teachers and as participants, we dig even further because, as Seymour said, the more we dig, and Professor Benjamin Quarles, I always remembered in his classes, he always said, history, his story, and we must make it our story.
Amen. Amen.
Amen.
And I want to,
Dr. Kirchner wanted to get her question.
yes, please.
And then on Harriet
Thank you.
as well. She has a question.
Thank you so much, Professor Green. This was just such a phenomenal thing. There really quickly three things. One, I think it's very important to kind of stitch the two presentations without the conversation, just the two presentations together into one video, because then it will be very easy to integrate it in courses. That's one thing. Second, I think we need to really move, and I'm going to do my part as member of the General Education Requirement Committee to raise the issue that the African diaspora course that is already a Gen Ed requirement should start with the history of Morgan and then talk about African diaspora. 3, as an immigrant, and I've been in the US, I entered the US first time to do my graduate studies in 1988. And I was on the fence whether I wanted to be a citizen of this country or not. I took the oath of allegiance in 2013 under Barack Obama because I was like, okay, this I can live in this country. I can call this home. My ancestors are from Afghanistan, who have been kicked out 5 times in the entire history of as far as we can trace our family tree. We've been kicked out once in the first Russian war, then when we went to Uzbekistan. From there, we were kicked out again in the second Afghan war. We landed in Pakistan. And then the third, I'm in the US now. So we've been kicked out from our places several times. I'm also a part of the Afghan diaspora. And the only place I really truly feel I belong is Morgan, even though I don't live in Baltimore. It's the institution and the intergenerational agency of the African American community that can save this country from itself. I truly believe that. And I think that we need to really make sure that we go beyond the issue of church and state. That's a separate issue. That's got nothing to do with academia. Academia is about a search for truth, whichever package it comes in. So if it comes in a package of the interagency, intergenerational agency of the African American people that is needed to be harnessed to take care of the founding fathers' dreams, irrespective of whether they were white or black, they did start an experiment that I truly believe in. I truly believe in that one person can chart their own destiny based on the authentic desires of their will as it corresponds to their inner beliefs. So that inner and outer dialogue is what higher education is all about applying the universal truth on your inner self truth, having a connection between the inner truth and the external truth. That is what higher education is all about. So we need to not just say that this is a controversial issue and this is church and state. It's got nothing to do with church and state. Higher education is about resolving the conflict between inner truths and the outer truths. It's about finding a place in the world. So I think that we need to really enlarge this circle. And I mean, I never even thought about the chapel as being the anchor for the Morgan State University, but it really is. I mean, these 2 presentations have made it very clear how the chapel itself is the anchor. And I'm not a Christian, but I think that everyone needs anchors. Without an anchor, the universal truth can eat us up. It's bigger than us. Higher education is all about connecting the inner and the universal truth. That's the business of education. So I think I would not be very worried about the church and state issue and not touch this issue. I think we need to really elevate this conversation and enlarge the circle. And that one issue of diversity, I mean, if you look at from the perspective of the globe, and as Professor Green pointed out last presentation as well, that the quad itself, the academic quad itself, sits on a place which is older than the African American community. Right? So it was there. There were people on it before the African American community. So that kind of that place-based link with diverse religions is something that we need to celebrate as well.
Sacred ground, Native Americans.
Sacred ground, exactly. And that sacred spiritual can come in many different forms. I mean, to me, my Islam is version 3 of the Abrahamic religions. The
Mm-hmm.
Quran actually recognizes the prophethood of Jesus Christ, and all the way through, all the prophets are recognized, and one has to acknowledge them before one even says the Shahada. You have to acknowledge the Bible and the Torah before you take the Shahada. That's a requirement. The part of the Shahada is related to, yes, the other two prophethoods are equally important. So spirituality comes in different forms, but its purpose is the same.
So many people don't even begin to, Professor Kirshner, understand the Abrahamic tradition of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. And one of the personal projects I've taken upon myself over this decade or so at Morgan is to help people understand the Abrahamic tradition, because it is so real and so vibrant, but so much has happened politically to make it very difficult for us to embrace. 90% of the problems in the world are traced to misunderstanding of what Ibrahim, and Abram represent to those three monotheistic religions. So that's a very powerful symbol. Before I turn it over to Dr. Green for any final comments, anyone else have anything they want to add? What a great time. Lauren?
Aunt Harriet
This is
trying to get
always,
into Mr.
this
House.
is always
Somebody
the,
trying to get in, Sam?
I'm
No, go
always
ahead,
pushing
Mr. House.
our founders. I don't think that a student should leave Morgan without being able to recite and know the names of our founders. Um, if they can't say those names, then there's something amiss. But, you know, and I'm still distressed that on this campus, nowhere are those names prominently displayed. Brown, Grisham, Harper, Grissom, and Green.
Hmm.
Those names ought to be known. If you can come to Morgan and pledge a fraternity and name the founders of those fraternal organizations and those sororities, something is amiss if you can't also repeat the names of our founders.
My mind.
And I've been pushing to say that the chapel, in my estimation, is our founders all. This is where it all began. And that's the end of my rant. But join me in making certain, you know, that
Professor Green, you said someone was trying to get in?
No, my Aunt Harriet is here, and I think she had a question.
Thank you, Dale. I'm not as much a question, but first I wanted to say, I'm always so proud of you, and you tell good stories. You tell great stories. You make great stories even better. But I wanted to make mention of technology, and you have done this in the past, and you're probably still doing it. But with technology today, it would be great to continue doing all histories of families that have been through the system and who have attended the chapel and things like that. Those oral histories will last a long time. The research that you've done, the pictures that we saw, and then believing that oral history that can be filmed now would be really good for students, and that's a project that students can get involved in, and you've done that with students as well. And I also wanted to say that Dr. Keel needs to be recorded as well, because just today, the nuggets of things that he said today were, things that can be passed on. But that's basically it. I can talk to you later about everything else.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
We want to again thank Professor Green. It occurred to me as you talked about the 6-decade presence of Dr. Cornish, you may be able to break that record, because you've been here in your 20s, your 30s, and going on, which is pretty amazing. You came as a teenager and has had a connection, a very vibrant connection with this institution since that time, and we're really grateful. And I think that Ken, your statement about the Native Americans is so true, that we want never to forget that once upon a time that was real, they were the stewards of this great nation we call America, and we must not ever forget the land and contributions that they've made. I will remind you again, Sunday night at 6 o'clock on WEAA. We will have our worship experience. Tamara, one of the people you see that you hear that is brother Waven will be on that experience, and it's just a really good time. I've been working on a sermon called Show and Tell that I'll be taping tomorrow. I'm not sure when it's going to air, but it reminded me a lot of, may have to go back and do some rewrite because of some great information I received today. Thank you again, and everyone have a safe and fulfilled week. Doing random act of kindness. Pray for a nation that's crippled by its own ego. And remember someone who is crying out, and yet their voice is muted, so that they would know that there are those who care, like Philip and those who were there for Paul to say that I do believe. Have a blessed time, everyone, and we'll see you next Thursday. Peace.
God bless.
And grace.
Yes.
Bye-bye, y'all.
A women,
A
amen.
women.
A women, amen.
Amen.
Yes.
All right.